Good afternoon. I'm Betty Casey, editor of TulsaKids magazine, and I'm here for the fourth installment of our series, Racism 101. Today's conversation is What's at Stake. Our partners in this conversation are OSU-Tulsa and Tri-City Collective, so I want to thank them for their partnership in this. This series started out as a discussion on racism, and we had three sessions of that, and we talked about the concepts and terms around racism, and we decided to go ahead and extend this conversation to do a monthly Facebook Live event discussing different issues and about inclusion, and maybe bring some voices in that we don't normally talk to. So our moderator today is Quraysh Ali Lansana, and Quraysh is the author of 20 books in poetry, nonfiction, and children's literature. Lansana is a Tulsa Artist Fellow. He's a writer in residence and adjunct professor at Oklahoma State University, Tulsa. He's a former faculty member of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the Juilliard School. Lansana is executive producer of KOSU NPR's Focus, Black Oklahoma, and his forthcoming titles include Those Who Stayed, Life in 1921 Tulsa After the Massacre, and Opal's Greenwood Oasis. He's a member of Tri-City Collective. I do want to mention Opal's Greenwood Oasis is a children's book. It's amazing. I've read it, and you can read all about it in TulsaKids November issue and find out how you can get a pre-reserve your copy of it as well. So thank you. Welcome, Quraysh.
Happy to be back in the saddle with you, Betty.
Good to have you here. Our panelists are Andy Cooper. She's a children's book author of Sometimes I Get the Wiggles. I also happen to have that book, which is excellent. Andy is also Special Services Team Lead for Community Action Project in Tulsa. She advocates and helps identify some of Tulsa County's most vulnerable children with suspected disabilities through her role as Senior Team Lead of Special Services at CAP. Andy is well known for her advocacy and fundraising efforts for the Lennox Gestalt Foundation. She serves as an ambassador for LGSF. She contributes her successes to her son, Cannon, who was diagnosed with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome at 3.5 years old after 3 typically developing years. Cannon now has an intellectual disability as well. Andy was named TARC's, which is now ARC, I think. They've changed their name, 2019 Parent Advocate of the Year. In 2016, she was named the honoree for the Leader in LGS Award, and 2014, the editor of the Oklahoma magazine named Andy Oklahoman of the Year for her dedication and advocacy work for her son and many others. Cannon's struggles with seizure control, peers, and school inspired Andy to become a published children's book author, to raise awareness and advocate for a population that oftentimes doesn't have a voice in their story. And to that end, I do want to mention that we have a list of resources on our on TulsaKids website, and Andy's book is part of that, so you can find out more about that. I also want to welcome Kay Luna. She's a biology and psychology double major at Tulsa Community College. She was born in Zacatecas, Mexico. She's lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma for 18 years. She grew up going to Jenks Public Schools, where she was driven by community service as well as her love for learning Spanish and more about her culture. She took Spanish classes all during her school career. She's hoping to get her bachelor's degree and then go to PA school to become a licensed assistant. And she wants to put her bilingual skills to good use while helping those in the community. So welcome, Kay. And then finally, but last but not least, Hannah Middlebrook is a native Tulsan. She's a graduate of Holland Hall and holds a BA in Interpersonal and Organizational Communication from the University of Colorado. Hannah is the Director of Operations for Trinity Episcopal Church in downtown Tulsa and is the mother of 3 teens, Cassie, Elliot, and Theo, with husband Chris. And I do want to give a shout out to husband Chris of BAM Entertainment. You may have seen him around town, but he does amazing children's shows as well as some other things. So I have seen him in action. All right, welcome everyone. And I do want to let everyone know that if you'd like to join the discussion, you can through the chat feature on Facebook Live, but you can ask questions or make comments, and we will bring those into the conversation as we go along. So I'll let you take over and start from here.
Thank you, Betty, and thank you to Andy, Kay, and Hannah for joining us in this conversation. So as Betty mentioned, this installment of Dismantling Racism in our series is What's at Stake, Diversity and the Election. And many networks and newspapers and many people, probably including everyone on this call, understand or at least have a belief that there's something very significant about this presidential election cycle that we are in, that we are 2 weeks away from voting in a moment where we're in the midst of a significant pandemic. And where even something that some of us who are older than 50 remember as pretty reliable, called the US Postal Service, has now suddenly gone through so many changes that recently it took 3 weeks for me to receive something in the mail from across town. So this is an unprecedented moment in US history that we are in. And this election is really like no other in recent memory. So I want to start with asking the three of you, what is the single most important issue for you in this election? And I will preface that, or I will add to that could be the presidential election or the many important state or local elections that are also on the ballot for this November. But what is the single most important issue for you in this election? Kay, you want to start?
Yes, I can start. I would think that for me personally and for the people around me who I know, the single most important issue that is on that ballot is a presidential candidate, and it's because of we're looking for immigration reform, and also those people with DACA status they're kind of on limbo, as in they don't know what is going to happen after the election depending on who gets elected. And ever since our current president was elected, DACA has been on limbo, and so those are the most important issues present for me personally.
Okay, and I want to thank you for that, Kay, and I want to circle back to immigration in a little bit. So thank you for that start. Let me go to Andy now about answering that question, the single most important issue for you.
I think for me and my son and the families that I serve at Cap Tulsa, so much of what has been missing in this current leadership is compassion. And, in so many aspects of my life and in the life of my son, I look for that compassion to bring people in and to surround us as a community. And whenever you look at the major leaders in our community right now, especially here, with Kojo running, the amount of compassion that he has shown to a great deal of people, and that he's ready to really move progressively forward. I'm really rooting for compassion here. And then the other part of that too is the Affordable Care Act. We have really, really benefited in being able to have dual insurances because there is a no clause right now that Obamacare has put in place that we are able to have Blue Cross and Blue Shield without a pre-existing condition, or they can't say because of that pre-existing condition that they can charge us more. And right now we're able to really get good coverage. But what does that look like moving forward if certain election and nominees were to move into place in office? How would that affect many of our population now? What would that look like for them?
Yeah, and it's pretty significant as well.
Right.
All right, I'm going to circle back to that as well. Hannah, what about you? You're muted, Hannah.
I was trying, it didn't want me to. Thank you guys for having me. I think Andy already addressed one of the big issues for us, which is the Affordable Care Act. But as the parent of a transgender teen, I'm on this panel to help bring some awareness about what families like ours face. So things that are really important for us in both state and national and local elections are issues of equality. And for all people, not just LGBTQIA+ folks, but all people. In particular, we would really like to see the Equality Act that was passed by the House and didn't make it to the Senate floor. We would like to see that passed. That protects people on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So, issues surrounding equality for all folks, particularly LGBTQIA+, for our family. That's top of mind.
And thank you for that, Hannah. And that actually is a sort of an interesting segue into the next question. And that is, what do you all believe is the climate of the country, in your opinion? What is the temperature of the United States of America right now, regarding those issues that you just mentioned, and certainly perhaps others? Where are we right now in terms of equality, in terms of inclusivity, in terms of being accepting or tolerant of difference, and different ideas, differing opinions? Where are we? Andy, you want to jump in on that?
Sure, thank you. I really have struggled with the climate that we're in right now for the last 3 years. I think that we are under a leadership that does not show compassion for a great deal of people, unless you are very white and very up and up. I think that this presidency and the climate in general has really done a disservice to people protected by DACA, protected by any LGBTQ, especially people with disabilities. I really think that we have to come a long way to kind of close that divide in this election to really serve all people, and it's the equality of all people, not just, like there's 3 very diverse candidates here today, and we're all talking about equality for all, all humans. It's not just for the certain man or the white collar, or the blue collar. And it's a very sad place to be in regards to raising my son in a climate where there's no leadership with compassion.
Kay, thank you, Andy. And Kay, you are the youngest person on this call, so you're going to have an insight that us old heads don't have necessarily, which is good because you all are going to save us, hopefully. We're rooting for you anyway. But what do you think, coming from the youth perspective, as well as a young person of color, where do you think this country is right now?
I think this country is very much divided. I remember back before the 2016 election, I felt that like people were nicer and that everyone was a lot more connected. And yes, there was some differences in opinion in people, but no one was outwardly like hateful and showing so much, I guess, racism as I have seen in these past 3 years. I think that definitely the change in power affected that a lot. And looking at social media, I can see that there's a lot of strong voices that back then were too young to vote, but are now making their voices heard because they have seen the inequality and the injustices that are still occurring today, and they are not okay with it anymore. Back then we were too young to vote, but now that we want our voices to be heard.
Thank you for that. That was a great answer, and I'm going to circle back to that as well. Hannah, what do you think? Where are we?
I think we are a country at the moment built on fear. Fear of the other, fear of difference. the administration has done the best they can to divide because it allows them to push through their administration. And I don't mind being political here, but it's in order to get through some of the things that this administration has been working on getting through, they have to make us afraid of each other. And so I think it's been a climate particularly based on othering other people and exclusion.
So let's follow up. Thank you, Hannah. Let's piggyback on that. Do you all, and also what Kay mentioned as well, do you believe that it's possible that we can recover from the very, very polarized state of the nation? Do you believe that it's possible to fix that, to overcome this division, this divisiveness? Andy, what do you think?
I sure hope so. But I do think with leadership change across the board that there is a lot of hope in circling back to diversity and the really, really special things that brings to the table. Because if you all have like-minded people at the table, what a boring world do we live in, you know? And like Hannah said, you know, we don't want to live in fear of each other. We want to be able to love each other again. And I think with the right leadership and, you know, much like that compassion piece that I spoke about before, just having an integral part in, you know, being a leader and really looking to make change and progress forward for the underdog is kind of how I feel these days. My son is biracial. He also has a significant disability, but he looks as typical as you and I, but I'm fearful for him. You know, I live in a state of fear for my own son, and I should never have to do that. And so many days we leave this house feeling like the underdog. And, you know, it is a heartbreaking thing, but I think that we can move past that.
Okay. Hannah, what do you think?
As Andy says, I hope so. I really hope so. I think it's going to take not just the administration making changes. I think it's going to take regular folks making changes. I hear a lot of people, particularly white folks, saying, you know, can't we just get along? Love is the answer. You know, we need to stop fighting. But in a way that, while it's a lovely sentiment, it brushes everything under the carpet. If people aren't willing to figure out why other people are hurt and why other people are angry, it's never going to be genuine progress. It's never going to be genuine love for each other. And sometimes that means making yourself a little bit uncomfortable trying to figure out why the other person is hurt. So I hope that with the change of an administration and some personal work, we can move forward. But I definitely would challenge people, if there's something you don't understand why people are upset about, do some work, do some digging.
Yeah, we're well beyond kumbaya, I think, Hannah. I think we're well beyond the guitars and the and the fire. Okay, what do you think?
I think that there can definitely be again, like a union between the different opinions and politically wise. And like Mrs. Andy said, I think it's gonna take having a change in leadership. And even if there is a change in leadership, I don't think it's gonna happen the next day. I think our country is gonna have to work hard for us to get back to this mindset where we're all working together to make a better country. But instead of this kind of mindset that I've seen people where it's like, oh, I'm voting for things on this ballot that are most important to me, that we have to, I think, kind of work hard for everyone to have a similar mindset. And even though we all have differing values, even though we're all might be in different political views, I think that there's this American dream that everyone talks about. And for that, to work for that American dream, for it to work for everyone, then there's definitely going to have to be changes in political policies that are currently happening right now. And I do think that younger generations are very passionate about wanting that change and for wanting equality. I know this is kind of random, but I have seen on platforms such as TikTok, so many young voices come together to speak for those who maybe don't have a voice, especially this summer when all these protests went on. And I do think that these younger people, they're a lot, I think that we can all work hard in order to make America what it once was, a lot more united.
Thank you for that. I know I mentioned to Miss Betty some time ago in one of our first 3 Facebook events that, and I tell my students at OSU-Tulsa this often, that I was as well and very encouraged this summer and through the protests that continue to occur throughout the country about the amount of diversity, that there were more folks who were more non-folks of color, more white folks involved in using their voices, marching the streets, what have you, than even more than folks who walked with Dr. King in the 50s and the 60s, you know. So it is encouraging, and we hope that you are right. This, again, Andy and Hannah and Betty and I, since we're old, we hope that you are right. We're putting our money on UK and your generation. So let me ask you all something. So we are on this call with 4 folks who identify as women, right? And so I want to ask you all about this. So where do you feel in this moment about women's rights? Where do you feel where the rights of women in this current moment in the country? And are you feeling comfortable? Are you feeling heard? Are you feeling supported? Are you feeling encouraged as women in this country? Hannah, what do you think?
Okay, it's working now. My mute button is playing up for me. I think that's a tricky question, honestly. I mean, obviously women in general have come so much further than, 2 decades ago, even when I was a kid, and comments that you would have heard that would have been commonplace in the workplace, you don't hear anymore and whatnot. For me, we're in a family where we don't have traditional gender roles. My husband's an entertainer. I met him wearing sequins and feathers, and I've been a facilities manager and wear work boots. So our family is probably a little atypical when it comes to that kind of thing. But I would say the more important thing at the moment is the intersectionality of being female and a person of color, or in the case of my daughter, being female and being transgender. There are, and even to go further, being a woman of color who is transgender. They've got the highest homicide rate in the country, which is just mind-boggling if you think about it. So I think as far as women are concerned, yes, our voices are being heard. Are they being heard at the level of men's? No, not at all. But I think women are also beginning to realize that, especially white women, we are not the most subjugated people on the earth. And we're coming together to try and amplify the voices of folks who have it a little bit harder than we do.
Have you found that work to be sort of nationwide, or is it, let's talk about in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Is that work, are folks actively engaged in that work in Tulsa, Oklahoma?
Surprisingly, yes, actually.
Okay.
We do have a little blue dot here. And there are a lot of folks working behind the scenes. It may not be as obvious to everybody, but for instance, in Tulsa, TPS has one of the most progressive policies to protect transgender children. And that's not specifically about women, but it protects gender identity. And,
right.
And that was before the whole bathroom bills thing started kicking off around the country. So there are people doing work, really progressive, fantastic work to amplify the voices of women, to amplify the voices of women of color. Yeah, all across the country. It just might not be as visible. We clearly won't compare with a California or New York State, but yeah, it's happening. It's happening all across the board, and changes are being made, and sometimes without people even realizing it's going on.
Well, you're right that even and that is encouraging in our little blue dot in this very, very red carpet. But to think about even the city of Tulsa recently changed the language to in terms of pronoun usage, which was encouraging as well. So you're right. We will. You know, I've only been back in Oklahoma 2 years after 28 in Chicago and a couple in Brooklyn. So I'm rooting for Tulsa too, just like I'm rooting for Kay. Kay, to that end, go ahead.
May I say something?
Sure.
As a woman, I think one of the major things that I'm concerned about for women in general, because women are typically, single women are more often thrust into poverty, especially when women with children. I think childcare, high quality across the board early childcare would be an important investment in the future of this country. And I think so many women have a very difficult time because there is nowhere to put their children. And I think this pandemic sort of highlights that, because women often are the ones who are the ones that need to stay home and also try to work and also care for the children and also educate their children. So I think often women are marginalized in that way. And of course, equal pay for equal work is still an issue for women. How is that possible?
Yeah.
So I think the hashtag #MeToo movement has been important for women, because women speaking out. I personally know women my age who were raped in college who never spoke out. And I know I have a good friend who's an athlete who had to swim on the boys' team before, you know, it was possible for women to participate in sports. So I think women, yes, we've come a long way, but I do think there's a long way for recognition of women and women's needs. And I think that's an important piece of this next election.
Can I just piggyback off of what you said there too, Betty? And I'm going to focus mostly on LGBTQ issues simply because that's where I'm coming from. That's the perspective of my family. But when you talk about, you know, your friend had to be on the men's swim team until there could be a women's swim team. A lot of transgender folks are facing similar fights right now. There's been a bill introduced in another state to prevent transgender girls from participating in girls' sports, and that is a deeper issue. You can talk a lot about that and the science behind it, but trans girls are facing a lot of these issues as well. And I will add that there are women who don't believe that trans women are women, or trans men are men, and that can be a struggle sometimes to, you know, try to be fighting for women's rights and then have people say, "You're not a woman. You don't get to participate in this conversation." So, you know, that's another issue going on.
Yeah, that's very real. Kay, let's go to you. Where are you? What's important to you about women's rights right now? Where do you think things are?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, sorry. My computer glitched. So as my fellow panelists have spoken about, women have definitely come a long way, and I like looking back in history books, I do see how right now women are in a very different social stance than they used to be. They have more opportunities, but I think something I was talking about TikTok earlier, and I saw this TikTok where somebody was asking female students and male students, like, hey, do you ever want to be a parent? And across the board, it was mostly males who all answered yes. And females were kind of questioning it, saying, I don't know, it depends like where I am in my career. And to me, this really stood out because in high school, I did research about how there was no paid time off for women who have babies, and they're expected to be back at work just a few weeks later. And I think that as my fellow panelists were talking about early childhood care, that's very important. But what else is important is having mothers have some paid time off so that they can be with their babies for a certain amount of time before they have to go back to work. And a lot of the times women have to choose between being able to feed their child or being able to spend time with them. And even if when they do go back to work, sometimes there is no one who they can leave their child with. And so I think that's a very important issue to me personally, because I do want to be a mom. And looking into the future, like, I'm always thinking about what sacrifices am I going to have to make in order to make that happen. And also another issue I have seen is the gender wage gap. And even though there is a wage gap between women and men, that gap is even larger between Latino women and white men. So those are some of the issues that I have seen.
Yeah, that's correct. And you are wise beyond your years, youngin. I will say, I thought that I thought about some years ago, and then we'll go to Andy, and that is that, as I mentioned, I spent 28 years in Chicago, and Alicia will get to that question in a moment. I spent 28 years in Chicago, so I was there not only for the entire Michael Jordan era, but that's not the point. I was there and personally had some interactions with the then Senator Barack Obama and Miss Michelle Obama before they became the president and the first lady. And I remember being engaged in a conversation with someone about how there was that talk surrounding that election, around that election time, that if Obama was elected, we would suddenly be in a post-race society. Like, race, you all remember this? Like, race was no longer a race, or racism was no longer a factor, because the country elected or was about to elect its first non-white president ever in the history of this country, which has been around a few centuries or so. And so, and I said to this person, okay, I don't believe this idea of post-race. I don't think that's even possible. I said, and then I presented this to this person. I said, so if Senator Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State then Hillary Clinton, were to be elected, would suddenly women be paid the same amount as men? Would that wage gap suddenly disappear if we elected Senator Clinton or Secretary of State Clinton as president? And the dude couldn't answer my question because he knew the answer was no, right? He knew the answer was no. And sadly, the patriarchy on which this country is founded is as prescient, is as in the water as the systemic racism that on which this country is based, right? So the dismantling of that business is also a long fight as well, but it shouldn't be. Neither of them should be, but they are, right? And that comes down to who holds the power and why, right? Andy, what do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I was just going to say that I think, women in general, it tends to start with they believe in something. And so I'll just say quickly, because I feel like everybody has covered this so well. Betty is somebody I've always looked up to, professionally speaking, just because Betty is always okay with writing about something that's uncomfortable, and she's always okay with being unpopular and still making a very valid point. And, you know, and she does it so professionally and she's so well spoken. And then, you know, where Hannah and I have taken a stance in motherhood of we have to change the world. And I call that quarterbacking. I always sit on the sideline because no one's going to change Cannon's world for him. If I don't do it, who's going to? And, you know, it's interesting because I have always felt secure in my career until now. At the age of 12, children with disabilities are looked at much different because childcare really stops at the age of 12 because most 12-year-olds can stay at home alone, right? And so now my crusade is, how do we get childcare in this county of Tulsa for kids with disabilities? There is a huge gap because from 12 to 18, there's really nothing here. And, you know, it's a hardship. You know, I didn't fall on the circumstances that I did lightly, and I haven't I wasn't seeking to be mother of the year. Like, you know, I'm just trying to survive, but it is truly out of really being the voice. And sometimes we're thrown into that. But Kay, I agree with everyone, what they're saying. You are out to set to change the world, young lady. You are doing an incredible job. You know, and this is all just solely based on your opinion and what you know of the world to date. And that's something really special. So, you know, I would definitely say I'm among some pretty great women today.
Yeah, I agree. Go ahead, Betty.
There's a couple of questions from Facebook. Who, and I don't know who this is directed to, maybe the whole panel, who's a woman in politics you admire? And also, this is probably for Kay, where do you see yourself after college? Because I think the rest of us have done that. So those are two questions coming in.
I'll be happy to speak about a woman in politics. I'm sorry, Kay, did I start speaking over you? Go ahead.
You can go ahead.
Okay, I'll go quickly. I would say a woman in politics that I am impressed with, two of them. One I would say is Elizabeth Warren, and one I would say is Amy Klobuchar. And to a lesser extent, because I've known her for less time, Kamala Harris. But the reason is these women have had to work double, triple, quadruple as hard to get where they're going. If you look at the number of bills that Elizabeth Warren has written and proposed compared to her male peers in the short time that she has been in the Senate, it is incredible what she has put forth. And the other two, you know, with their moonshot careers, as they have just sort of accelerated through the ranks of their various professions, you know, through the law and through government, local governments, and into the national spotlight. I think just knowing how hard women have to work in general to get anywhere that they're going, and seeing the quality of what these women are doing and the speed with which they're doing it is just really incredible.
Two women that I really look up to are Kamala Harris and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. As a woman of color, and as a Latina, I definitely identify with Mrs. AOC a lot. And I have seen how she has gone into Congress and how she has put her foot forward and has not taken a lot of slander that she's received from these fellow congressmen. And I think that her strong personality is something that women really need in order to have their voices heard, because she's not only speaking on issues of women, but also immigration policies, which are very important to me. And to answer that second question, what do I see myself doing after college? I want to become a licensed physician's assistant, and I want to be someone that can have a voice in healthcare for some underrepresented groups, such as maybe undocumented patients and people who maybe don't have affordable healthcare. So yeah, those are my answers.
Thank you. Andy, who do you admire?
I would definitely say the three women that both of these ladies spoke about, AOC, Elizabeth Warren, and Kamala Harris. And then I just wanted to mention too, I think it's really interesting because I didn't mention the fact that women in leadership are also not necessarily respected quite by our current leadership as a country. And I think that that also was projected quite surprisingly with questions to Amy Coney Barrett asking about, they were asking how she was going to be able to juggle this role and her family because she does have several children. And, and it's like, I was listening to NPR afterwards and they were talking about how a man has never been asked those questions and just how far we still have to go when it comes to women in politics. But I agree. I know enough about Kamala Harris and she is pretty bold. And I really appreciate a bold woman in a woman in general. I think these women are who go and get things done.
Betty, we have other questions, I believe.
Yes, this one, is your institution where you work or go to school encouraging people to stop racism? If so, how? If not, what should they be doing to fight for racial justice? So who wants to start with that one?
Yeah. Okay, Andy.
I'm happy to talk a little bit about CAP Tulsa. The really beautiful thing about CAP is we serve an underserved population in Tulsa County. And Kay, what you were speaking about as far as affordable health care for all, not just for, certain populations, especially undocumented children and especially undocumented children with disabilities, there is a great need for that work. And CAP Tulsa really, I think, goes above and beyond to, we do a lot of trainings in-house in regards to race and diversity and inclusion and what that looks like. We just had Tracy Spears come in and do a presentation on inclusion and diversity. And, we really take pride in being able to serve an all population, that it's not just certain children and that it's not just certain parents, it's every parent. And we want to see them, especially with our program like Career Advance, we want to make sure every parent has the same opportunities. We don't want to just see certain families thrive.
Hannah, you have an interesting work environment. You work at a church. You want to talk a little bit about what the church does?
Absolutely. I work at Trinity Episcopal Church, which is downtown. And the Episcopal Church, the National Episcopal Church, is a much more progressive church than many that you'll find across the country. Our presiding bishop, that's the big dog over everybody, he is Bishop Michael Curry. Some people will recognize him from the royal wedding. He was the one who delivered the sermon. He is really working hard to direct the entire church to do what we can do to dismantle racism. And the Episcopal Church is known as sort of a more affluent white church. And so there's a lot of work to be done. Locally, Trinity, we've been participating in the Oklahoma Diocese has been putting forth a program called Sacred Ground. It's actually a national church program, but the diocese here in Oklahoma is doing it right now, and it's an anti-racism program. I think it's 20 weeks of anti-racism training, heavy workload in reading and lots of discussions, and I'm taking part in that this year, and it is fascinating. I'm learning so much, and I always feel as if I kind of have an edge on some folks in Oklahoma already, but there's so much more for me to learn. And then locally, at our church in particular, we have a class right now called, I don't know if you are familiar with the book, Waking Up White and Finding Myself in the Story of Race by Debbie Irving. We are doing a discussion class on that book right now. And so, yes, we do actively work towards dismantling the systems of racism. At Trinity, we've got a long way to go. We don't have near as much diversity as far as race and nationality and color in the church as we would like to. We have a lot of LGBTQ folks. the church offered to do a renaming service, a rebaptism for my daughter when she came out. So, you know, it's incredibly inclusive, incredibly affirming place. But yeah, we still have a long way to go. We're also currently working on finding out what our role in the 1921 race massacre was, so that we can then deal with what we need to deal with there. So yeah, we're addressing it for sure.
I want to just point out that you talked about discussing this book. I'm assuming you're doing it through Zoom. What a great idea. I mean, getting a group of people, whether it's a church, a synagogue, or just a group of friends, to choose a resource like that and discuss it. And especially if you could get a variety of people involved in it. What a great idea. I love that.
This book in particular is a great one too, because it actually, at the end of every chapter, it poses questions to you. So you don't need somebody who's facilitating or moderating or anything. It's all right there. So it's a great place to start if anybody wants to start their own.
Kay, what about you? You go to school. What about you when you're in this regarding this question, encouraging people to stop racism? Do they do anything at TCC, or did you see anything in high school?
Well, at TCC, I think there's definitely resources, and like the faculty does encourage things for diversity. Like I'm a part of a group called HSA, the Hispanic Student Association, and I think that within that group we do have a lot of conversations about racism and how we can go forward as a Latino community in order to maybe have our voices heard and continue the conversation in order for racism to end. And I remember in my spring semester, I took a Composition 1 class, Composition 2, and my professor had us read a book called Who Speaks for the Negro. And we learned a lot about the civil rights movement. And I think that was definitely a place where people had that conversation started, because a lot of people back, especially before like the protests this summer, a lot of people were kind of quiet about how racism is still happening today in the United States. And I think that was definitely a conversation starter for many of my fellow classmates. But I do think that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, because not everyone's going to take that same Composition 2 class, and not everyone's going to read the same material. Not everyone's going to be an HSA. And I think that the college can do a lot more in order for students to maybe feel more included, as well as have other students have these tough conversations. Because even though through like the outreach center, which is how I was able to enroll for college at TCC, a lot of students who aren't maybe in the who aren't minority students, for a lot of them, they're not having these tough conversations. For a lot of them, it's not the same. It doesn't affect them, so they're more focused on school, which is important. But I do think that with the political climate, how it is today, that us the younger generation do need to have these tough conversations, and that we do need to be educated in order for there not to be so much racial inequality in the United States. And even in high school, I felt that there was even less, because I went to mainly there was minority students, but there was a lot more white students at Jinx, Oklahoma. And I think that even when the election occurred in 2016, that a lot of those students said things that weren't very okay to say, and they were a little bit racist, and maybe that they didn't see anything wrong with that, because at that level we weren't really having conversations of racism and racial inequality. And I feel like there is a lot of work that needs to be done in order to have these conversations in a school setting.
You're absolutely right, Kay. There's a great deal of work that needs to be done everywhere, but definitely in K-12 educational settings, and even at the university level as well. There's a great deal of work that needs to be done. And that was a great response. I'm going to ask you a question, Kay, that you'd be surprised to know, I'm sure, that many older folks don't know the answer to this question, Kay. And that is this, right? So we, at least scholars and some folks in some degree of the know, refer to your generation as Latinx, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some older folks don't know what that means. They also don't know whether or not to refer to you as Hispanic or Latina, right? Folks, older folks, and even some folks who are of your generation who are just ignorant, don't know the right word or geographical identifier for folks from Mexico or folks from Guatemala or folks from Brazil. So I would like for you, if you don't mind, to do the Facebook event live audience and a lot of ignorant folks a favor and break this down for folks. You mind?
I don't mind.
Thank you.
So the term Latinx is a very respectful way of referring to the Latino and Latina culture. And that is because that is including LGBTQ plus individuals who don't have a gender identity. So instead of being Latina or Latino, we just refer to the whole community as Latinx and they're Latinx individuals. Hispanic people are those who come from Spanish-speaking countries. So that would include Spain, but also all of Latin America, and those are Hispanic people. Latinx people are anyone who comes from Latin America, such as Mexico, Central America, and South America, and Brazil is included in that. So someone from Spain would not be considered Latino or Latinx, but they are Hispanic because they do speak Spanish. But someone from Brazil would be considered Latinx, but they wouldn't be considered Hispanic since the main language in Brazil is Portuguese.
You don't know how many folks you just educated in that 5 minutes. So I just thank you very much, Kay. You don't know how many minds just went, I have knowledge I never possessed. I can stop tripping over myself. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. All right, so we have to wrap up soon. Do we have any other questions, Betty?
No, I don't think so. No,
Okay.
not this time.
Okay, so then let me bring up, circle back to something that Hannah, I believe you mentioned. So yesterday, in fact, we learned that on this third dig that actually remains were found, and probably more to come today, but what appears to be a grave shaft at Oaklawn Cemetery, where more remains are expected to be uncovered from the massacre from 1921. You mentioned, Hannah, that that your church was sort of looking into its history, looking into its involvement, to find ways to respond. So what I would like for all three of you to tell us is, when did you learn about the massacre to begin with, right? When were you introduced to Greenwood, right, and or the massacre? So Andy, why don't you start us off?
So I definitely did not know about the massacre in high school. It was not until after college, actually, that I knew about the race riot. And Greenwood was definitely within the last 10 years. I mean, really the new culture of Greenwood and what they have created that is so special, that they have really taken the power and to build up down there has, there are so many great leaders in that community, in that history, that have taken such a great deal of pride in the work around Greenwood, and it has definitely become more prominent to me in the last 10 years.
Thank you. Hannah?
I'm kind of more unusual in the Tulsa area in that I've known about it since childhood. My grandmother, I live in the same house my grandmother grew up in, which is privilege in and of itself. But she worked very hard to make sure we knew the history. I didn't even realize it wasn't taught in school until I was well out of school, because we'd always known about it in my house. The interesting thing is, well, I mean, it's heartbreaking. The stories that my grandmother would tell would be about flatbed trucks of bodies driving by. I wish now that I'd asked more questions, because I don't remember all the details, and I certainly didn't get all the details then. But she would talk about how the family had to go down to TU, the old TU stadium, to pick up their, as she would say, they had to go pick up their coloreds. And my grandmother was, for her generation, leaps and bounds ahead as far as not being racist. But the language and the rhetoric of the time, it was part of who she was. But she centered herself in the story a lot. She would talk about, you know, my father saved them. My father had to keep them safe. And, you know, they're hiding in the basement here at the house, and that's how they were keeping them safe. And it was kind of infantilizing. So when I look back now at the way I was taught about it, I was taught, wow, my family did great things to save people from the massacre. I didn't learn as much about the actual occurrences, the things that were actually happening, the human stories, other than the fact that there were several families of Black people in our basement trying not to be killed. So yeah, I've known about it for a long time. I wish I had known what questions to ask at the time.
Well, I'm going to email you about that. I want you to write that story down, and there's a reason for that. So, Kay, when did you learn?
I was introduced to like that history in my Oklahoma history class in 9th grade, but we didn't really go into depth about it until I was a freshman in college. So it was 4 years later that I really did like get to learn a lot about it. And I do I do think I learned a lot more about it this summer, whenever the whole Juneteenth celebration, people were talking about that, and with the civil rights movement that was going on over the summer and that is still happening, I think I did learn a lot more that I didn't know. And as a Tulsan, because I consider myself a Tulsan, I think that it was shocking to find out some of the things that I did and that I didn't know, and that weren't brought to light to the bigger public until this past summer.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, you are probably the only one among us who actually were introduced to this in school when you were supposed to be. But we won't get into that slippery slope. Betty, do we have time for one more comment? Or are we
I think we probably need to wrap up. I think we're at the end. I just thought this panel was amazing. You guys were, I learned a lot, as I always do, by doing this, and I really truly appreciate all of you sharing your thoughts, your views. My whole desire for these sessions is to educate people in the community and to help them get to know other people in the community that they may not know, and hear other voices that they may not hear. So I hope that we've accomplished that. I do want to thank OSU-Tulsa, Quraysh. I want to thank Tri-City Collective for helping us sponsor this and connecting all of us. And this will be up on TulsaKids Facebook or OSU-Tulsa's Facebook if you want to direct people to watch it. I think everyone should hear this conversation. And I do want to remind people that we will have an ongoing series. In November, we'll be talking about Thanksgiving and what you think you know about Thanksgiving and why it's probably wrong, and going back to what we've all learned about it. So it will be, I guess, the third Wednesday, whatever this Wednesday is, same time, noon to 1, and we'll be talking to some Native American panelists for that. But I want to thank everybody. And again, I so appreciate you taking the time to do this. And thank you, Quraysh. You were great, as always.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Kay. Thank you, Betty. And thank all of you for tuning in, and join us again in a month.
Yes. All right.